Hi, I'm Dave Essinger, and I'm here with our visiting writers Brendan Kiely and Jessie Chaffee today, part of the UF Visiting Writers series. They both have new novels out. To start with, maybe you could both tell us something about your new books.
Sure. So my novel, it's my debut novel. It's called Florence and Ecstasy. It's set in Florence, Italy in the present day. It's narrated by an American woman, a 29-year-old American woman named Hannah, who flees to Florence from Boston in the aftermath of dealing with a number of issues in her own life, including an eating disorder. So she finds herself in a city filled with beauty and vitality and food, which is a complicated backdrop for her. Hannah joins a rowing club where she learns to scull on the Arno River in Florence and becomes drawn into the vitality and social scene of the city in Florence. And at the same time, she discovers through art and lore the histories of the medieval and Renaissance women mystical saints like Catherine of Siena, who were famous for their ecstatic visions and also for starving themselves for God. And they give her a language for kind of understanding some of the issues that she's been through, and she ends up being torn between the kind of vital life of Florence in the present and these women from its past.
Sure, and it's been getting some great reception already, right?
Yeah, it's
some great reviews.
It's been getting some good coverage, great thoughtful reviews. So it's been
NPR,
really exciting.
The San Francisco Chronicle, to name a few.
Everywhere you want to be. Great. Well, I want to come back. I kind of want to cut back and forth and talk about both of your books. Brendan, can you tell us about, this is your third novel, right? So
absolutely.
Tell us about the new one first.
Sure. So yes, this is my third novel. This is the last true love story. And essentially it's a dual love story. It's about love at the end of life and about first love and how these two stories come together in one family. And so it's about two 17-year-olds, a boy and a girl, who spring an Alzheimer's-afflicted grandfather from an assisted living facility in Los Angeles, take him on a cross-country road trip to upstate New York so that the grandfather can get back to the hill where he first kissed his wife to try to hold on to these memories of his deceased wife. And meanwhile, the two 17-year-olds are falling in love for the first time. Teddy Hendricks is the boy, and Karina is the young woman. And what's exciting about her is not only is she the driver, the one who can actually get them out of town, because the grandfather can't drive and neither can Teddy, but she's also a musician. And her reason for leaving LA is that she wants to do some work with a band out in New York City. But in truth, not only is she the driver, the engine of action, because she's a musician, music is used as therapy quite often for patients of Alzheimer's disease. And so her ability and skill as a musician enables the grandfather to tap into stories from the past and remember, in fact, some of those loving moments he had with his wife. So,
sounds like a great read. I'm looking forward to getting into that book myself. I'm in both of these. And I know that you've both done an awful lot of research behind these.
Sure.
Jessie, you did a Fulbright in Italy researching some of the background for this, and Brendan, I've heard you talk some already about some of your research into Alzheimer's and aging. Could you both tell us a little more about the kind of research you did and how that shaped the book as it came out?
Sure. I'll just share briefly, anecdotally, the research that I've done begins in the family, as the story is literarily an homage that I can talk about at some point down the road, but within the family, I wanted to write this book for my grandmother because my grandfather passed away from Alzheimer's disease. And so a lot of what I was relying on was family history and family experiences, though nothing is a direct result. It's not exactly my grandfather. It's certainly not my grandmother, who's still alive. But relying on those moments and some time that I spent, in fact, with my own grandfather. In addition, I'll just share that I am incredibly grateful to the Alzheimer's Association of America, who threw open their files and their doors in a way that enabled me to understand the compassion it takes to really take care and help those with Alzheimer's disease. The one thing that I learned from them that I always want to share with anybody who ever is listening is the kind of mantra that they reminded me: we have to love the person who is there, not the person we want to be there.
Right.
And I think that's a really that's the kind of kernel of what Teddy learns as well. He can't expect his grandfather to be someone he isn't, but instead, once he learns to embrace loving the person who is there, he learns so much more about his own family's history and about what it means, in fact, to be to take risks and fall in love.
Yeah.
So.
Well, it's so when I began this book, I didn't realize I don't have Catholic in my background at all, and I hadn't imagined that these women from the past were going to be a part of it. But in the writing, I was writing one scene in which my character Hannah first encounters in the medieval hilltop town of Siena St. Catherine. She goes to a basilica there where they have preserved St. Catherine's mummified head and finger, but also these images of the saint. And one of them is a fresco of St. Catherine in ecstasy receiving the stigmata. And in another image, it's St. Catherine healing a possessed woman, who the possessed woman is in a very similar position to St. Catherine in ecstasy. And so I began thinking about a woman dealing with having become a stranger to herself and her own body, trying to grapple with that situation of her own form of ecstasy and grappling with, am I the woman possessed or am I the saint? Am I the calm woman looking on? Am I possessed by, something positive or something negative? And I realized that the women from the past were going to be important to the story that I was telling in the present. And it was at that point that I realized I had to dig a lot more into these women from the past with whom I hadn't had much experience. And I applied for the Fulbright grant, and we were able to spend a year in Italy sort of on the trail of some of these women, some of whom, like St. Catherine, are very well known, and some of whom are much lesser known. And so it is this kind of I think, parallel history in Catholicism and also in Italy itself. And so being there certainly shaped the content of the book, what's in the book, how the saints come into the book. And I also spent a lot of time there thinking about, what did these women mean in the past and what do they mean today?
You alluded to we. I think it's only fair that we remind folks or let them know we're also married. So we're part of
and that's why we get them as a 2-for-1. That's why we get them both together as part of our visiting writers series. And I wanted to ask how that was too, as far as I want to come back and talk about the research a little more on some things. But
sure.
Since this is a segue into that, okay, you're married. You're both novelists. How is that? Is that good having each other to bounce your work off of? How well does that work? Does it ever get in the way artistically? Are you trying to do one thing at one time? And
right.
Tell us about this. Yeah.
Well, I'll start backwards, and I'll say that. So I was teaching high school when my first novel came out. The first novel is The Gospel of Winter, and it's the story of a 16-year-old boy who's struggling to decide whether or not he should tell the world he's been abused by a priest. And I was incredibly grateful that I got to publish this novel that it really speaks to the heart of the kind of community that I know and grew up around outside of Boston. But when that book was published, like I said, I was teaching high school, and as Jessie was just sharing with you this sort of the research that she needed to do for Florence and Ecstasy. She was awarded this Fulbright grant. So we were married, and Jessie was going to Italy. And what the heck? I wasn't going to stick around and teach high school. And no way, of course I was going to go travel Italy with my wife. It Forget the last true love story. That's the best love story. The reason why I share all this is that it is, in fact, the relationship of our art that enables us, I think, to help each other out. And so, just like any good, I hope, healthy relationship, you're able to share along the way. And so since Jessie was taking this trip, it enabled me the free time to work on more projects. In fact, I wrote the last true love story, the bulk of the first draft, the year we were in Italy, because I'd never had that gift of time before. And so it was the kind of sharing of each other's artistic, not a pot of gold, but rather maybe like a little satchel of gold that I always think of. That's also how things began, too.
Yeah, we met in graduate school in the MFA program at City College in New York, and both at a point in our lives where we were committing to our art and something we were really passionate about. And we met in the novel workshop. I was just starting this novel, and Brendan was working on his first novel. And so we really met through our writing and through the thing that we were passionate about, and we got to know each other through our writing. And so I think it's always been a part of our conversation. And I think as we were falling in love with each other, we were also getting to know each other as writers, and that's no accident, right? We write about the things that we care about that are meaningful, and what you can learn about somebody from the work they produce is a lot. And so that we connected on that level was the beginning, and so it's remained a part of it. I mean, we're still each other's first readers. We still, talk about the great stuff and also the frustrations.
I was wondering at what point you read each other's drafts. Do you find yourselves kind of internalizing each other as readers, thinking, oh, Jessie's not going to like this chapter. Brendan will want me to do this with this chapter or something. Do you find that conversation happening kind of pre or?
That is such an interesting question. I don't know.
Maybe.
Yeah, maybe because as you were beginning the question, I was like, no way, man! Like I write my own stuff. But truthfully, that's silly because in fact I maybe would say yes in some way, some internalizing of sharing some of that. But that to me is, again, a gift because, I wasn't going to fall in love with a dummy. It's an absolute gift. And part of it, too, is I think that writing is always seen as such a solitary act. Writing is always a solitary act in which you're taking great risks. And for us to be able to share the real rough stuff with someone that you trust, even if at its most base level, it's that first opportunity to share it and get it off, the private space and into something public, but the safest kind of public space there is. I find as a writer is very helpful because it feels like a springboard. So no matter what the feedback is, like start all over again, or this is great, or whatever it may be. Just having gotten it out there in that shared public space, so to speak, is a gift, I think, for production.
Kind of like partly externalizing without putting it all the way out in the world yet, right?
Yeah.
And I think we end up having a lot more conversations when work is in process. So I'll rarely give you something to read that hasn't been gone over on my own, but when I'm coming up with the ideas, when I'm figuring out what direction to go in, when I hit a wall, like having somebody with whom you can have that conversation who, even if, we're not a part of every step of the product, knows what's important to you and what it is that you're trying to say. Having somebody to think through that with is really incredible.
Yeah. Absolutely.
I'm sure, I bet. So follow-up. You don't have to answer this, but have you ever, I'll just pitch that out there, have you ever gotten advice from each other and just said, no, I'm not taking that, no, that's wrong? Because I have, first readers where somebody will say, you should do this with this line, chapter, whatever, and I can ignore their advice if I want to because I don't live with them. But have you been in that situation where have you had advice from each other where you think, okay, I know what he means here, but no, the opposite or something, right?
I think I recognize that as being a good possibility. So if I give Brendan some advice and he's like, oh, I don't think that's quite right, but it made me think that I should go this direction, like,
yeah.
I never feel like there's anything personal in it. I feel like if the advice I give, gives you an idea to go in a totally different direction, that's awesome. Cool. And sometimes that's what you need.
Yeah. I remember specifically some help with The Last True Love Story, where I said, thank you very much for that idea. Definitely not going to do that. And a few months later, found myself gravitating back towards that idea.
Doing exactly that, right?
Because it was actually a really great solution for considering some balance and symmetry in the narrative structure of the novel, and that's okay too, because I think that again, it's a level of trust. There are plenty of moments where it's, I might suggest something when you're grappling with something in the Florence and Ecstasy, and you'd say thank you very much, but that's not helpful at this time, and that's fine. That's how you
Right.
negotiate it, because the foundation is trust.
Yeah.
But also that piggybacking off of each other in the post-publication phase is also really helpful, because as we're trying to talk about our books and get them out there, as you know, as a writer, it can be a lonely game after you've written the darn thing as well. And so part of what's exciting now as well is that we can try to bounce these ideas of how do we get this book out into people's hands, because I want certainly every young woman in America to read Florence and Ecstasy for its sort of deep truths with grappling with the experience of being a woman in America, and also in Italy, but especially this kind of the sense of a woman's experience that's connected to deep historical references and resonates in that way. So of course it's helpful for us to help each other out and say like, oh hey, this festival is going on, maybe they have room on a panel for that or whatever. So I think it works both ways.
Absolutely.
Well, and you mentioned, I'd like to come back to this, how you're both writing about some pretty important issues in all of your books so far, and in all of yours, Brendan, and in yours, Jessie. We were talking about this a little bit at lunch about how can fiction do this? How do you see people relating to the issues that you're writing about, maybe in a way that you couldn't do in nonfiction, or how do you see, sorry, a long tangled question, I guess I'm going somewhere, but how do you see people relating to the stories that you're creating that gets to a conversation about these big societal issues?
It's a great question. So with Florence and Ecstasy, it's, I hope that, I'll say I think many people everywhere, but in particular in this country, have complicated relationships with their bodies and with food, and so this is certainly in part about a woman who is at war with her own body. And I had an experience with an eating disorder myself years and years ago, and it's very different than Hannah's experience and doesn't kind of go to the extremes that hers does. But it left me, it haunted me, and it left me with the kind of what if I hadn't gotten out of it as quickly as I did? What if I hadn't had the support? What if I didn't trust that support? And it was also an issue I hadn't seen explored in fiction in the way that I had experienced it. And so in part, I wrote the book that I wanted when I was in that place myself. And fiction really allowed me to do that, because it allowed me to create a story about it that wasn't just about my own small experience, but that was on a larger canvas, and was this woman dealing with it in her own life, but then connecting it to the longer history of women's relationships with their bodies, and that long, very complicated history. And at the same time, I hope, and I've been gratified when people respond to the book who have dealt with eating disorders, and also people who have dealt with other addictions, challenges, moments in which they've become strangers to themselves and are trying to find a way forward. And so I also wanted to create a fictional world in which that was happening, that might resonate with people and
Sure.
and help them in thinking about that.
I don't know. I know you're a runner, and in just
True.
when you're out there, and maybe I run slowly, so maybe there's more room for thought when I'm running. But I find engaging in an act like that meditative in some way, so that I am. It allows room for thought in a way that I don't have in my everyday experience.
Sure.
And that could be true if I'm swimming. It could be true if I'm if I'm going for a run. It may even just be like a walk in the park and I don't have my earbuds in for once and I kind of have headspace. What I find really interesting about the experience of reading a novel is that you enter into a kind of quiet headspace, but in dialogue with someone else. And that for me then creates a much richer, deeper kind of communication. It's not scanning a headline on my phone. It's not, kind of catching even, frankly, a headline or a line or two from, NPR radio. It's the depth that is required to retain the information from a novel. I think it's something separate and unique. And it's because of that relationship and that depth that I think engaging in issues of societal importance are really well handled in literature and in novels. So if I'm trying to help folks in this book, for example, grapple with conversations around ageism or conversations about the multiple definitions of how we can create a family in our country today, and try to get away from the notion of there's one sort of prototype family that is the normal, and I throw the quotes around that because I don't like that word.
Sure.
But to sort of talk about the variety of families that are out there and what that means to make family and create family. Then I think you can do that in a novel in a way that's harder in other mediums because you don't have the same time. Or in my second novel, which is called All American Boys, it's a conversation about race and racism in America, and frankly, how that issue of our country, which is foundational to our country's conception and inception, and continues today in institutions, whether we're talking about education or we're talking about housing, we're talking about healthcare, but in our novel, All American Boys, we're talking about it with regards to law enforcement. And so there's a space for that kind of dedicated dialogue that you can have with a book. And so I love that question because I think any chance we get today to talk about why people can benefit from slowing down and engaging with a novel, the better. That slowing down, an art that helps us slow down, I think is a thing we need to do more in our society.
Sure, and immersion, right? Something that will let us approach those topics in a way that's maybe not direct, head on, but I feel like in both of your works so far that's it is trying to get at some of these issues. Where am I going with that? In a way that's engaging, but also helps us to understand the protagonist as opposed to this kind of like external view that we have where we see like the issues exist, we see them happening, on the newspaper, all that stuff.
Yeah, that I agree.
There's some understanding and room in there to empathize with the character, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think we're both asking for a really active emotional participation on the part of the reader. And if you can, that's the great thing about fiction. If you can tell a story that's engaging enough, then people don't realize they're sort of tricked into the feeling of it and the thinking about it. And I guess it's no accident that we both have written, first person books that are very close to the emotional reality of the protagonists.
Including all their flaws.
Yeah.
So that it isn't an agenda-oriented piece like you might have if you're writing a manifesto, or you have a quick line to deliver to sell an ad or something.
Sure.
It's a complicated emotional experience with flawed characters who are telling you their story, but telling it emotionally and honestly. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So So if readers out there are looking for a new, engaging, immersive read, where can they find your books? Everywhere.
Everywhere books are
Everywhere
sold.
books are sold.
Amazon,
I love
Barnes
it,
and
yeah.
Noble, your local independent bookstore.
Love the indie booksellers. Yeah.
And,
Absolutely.
And I think it's also important to remind folks that yes, our books are available everywhere, but also engage with us on social media. Because I think one of the great things about being an author today and being a reader today is that there's a lot more room for that community conversation. So find us on Twitter, find us on Facebook, find us on Instagram, engage with us. We want to talk to you about the book after you've read it, so check it out.
Absolutely.
And if you're lucky, maybe you can even engage with them live. We're going to have the opportunity to hear you both read from your work tonight at Ritz Auditorium in Old Main. So we're looking forward to that. Brendan, Jessie, thanks a lot for being here.
Thanks so much for having us,
Thanks for having
Dave.
us, man.